Rain tapped softly against the cafe windows as evening settled over the city, blurring headlights into long streaks of gold and white across the wet streets outside, while inside the small coffee shop conversations remained quiet. Coffee machines hissed in the background, and people sat alone or together beneath warm lights trying to escape the weather and, in some cases, themselves. And despite the calm atmosphere, one table near the window felt heavier than all the others, because heartbreak has a way of changing the way of a room without changing anything visible inside it. At that table sat a young man staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, replaying the same conversation over and over again inside his mind. Every sentence, every expression, every moment that had led to the words he could not stop hearing. "I think we should end this." The relationship was over. No betrayal, no dramatic fight, no obvious villain, just departure. And somehow that made it worse. Because when people can blame someone, pain becomes simpler. When they cannot, pain becomes personal. Around him, life continued. People laughed. Friends talked. Music played softly through hidden speakers. Yet none of it seemed connected to him anymore. Because rejection creates a strange illusion. It convinces people that a single person's decision has somehow become a verdict on their worth. And that illusion had already begun taking hold. The young man stared through the rain-covered glass and asked a question that countless people have asked throughout history. Why wasn't I enough? And beside him sat Friedrich Nietzsche. Calm, silent, observing, not the breakup, but the meaning being attached to it. And after a long silence, Nietzsche finally spoke. He said, "The most dangerous thing about rejection is not losing another person. It is allowing their decision to become your identity." And the young man looked up, because for the first time that evening, someone was talking about something deeper than heartbreak. The rain continued falling outside. The cafe remained warm. The soft conversations, the clinking cups, the quiet music drifting through hidden speakers all continued exactly as before. And yet, somehow, everything had already begun to feel different. Because once a painful thought begins to move inward, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because attention moves somewhere deeper, somewhere less comfortable. And the young man sitting beside the rain-covered window felt that shift, even if he could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the story he had been telling himself since the breakup. And when a story begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow, and awareness is rarely gentle, because awareness does not remove pain. It removes illusions. The young man looked down at his coffee, then toward the rain, then back toward Friedrich Nietzsche. And after several silent moments, he asked a question that was really haunting him. If her leaving doesn't mean I wasn't enough, then why does it feel like it does? And the question carried something new. Not heartbreak, not anger, but doubt. And doubt is always heavier than sadness, because sadness hurts the heart. Doubt attacks identity. Nietzsche answered calmly. He said that most people do not merely lose relationships. They lose the version of themselves that existed inside those relationships. And the words settled heavily into the young man's mind, because suddenly the pain looked different. For weeks he had believed he was mourning another person, but perhaps he was mourning something else entirely. The future he imagined, the life he expected, the identity he built around being loved. And Nietzsche continued. He said that many people secretly hand over their self-worth to the people they love, not intentionally, not consciously, but gradually, one compliment at a time, one shared dream at a time, one emotional dependency at a time, until eventually they no longer ask, "Do I value myself?" They ask, "Does this person value me?" And when that person leaves, everything collapses, not because self-worth disappeared, but because it was never truly theirs to begin with. The young man remained silent, because something inside him had already begun to shift. Not agreement, recognition. And recognition is often more painful than heartbreak itself. A woman sitting alone nearby quietly glanced toward them, then asked a question of her own. What if losing someone leaves a hole that never fully closes? The question lingered beneath the warm cafe lights. Because everyone understands loss. Everyone understands absence. Everyone understands the strange ways certain people continue living inside memory long after they are gone. Nietzsche looked toward her, not with sympathy, not with indifference, but with clarity, and he said that some wounds never completely disappear. But that is not the same thing as being destroyed by them. The words moved through the cafe differently this time, because they did not promise healing. They promised growth. And growth is always more demanding than healing. Healing asks for time. Growth asks for transformation. The rain continued tapping against the glass. People continued entering and leaving the cafe. Life continued moving forward. And that fact itself felt unfair. Because heartbreak creates the illusion that the world should stop with you. But it never does. And Nietzsche continued. He said that rejection becomes most dangerous when people turn it into evidence. Evidence that they are unworthy. Evidence that they are unlovable. Evidence that they have failed. And once pain becomes evidence, suffering becomes identity. The young man slowly lowered his eyes, because he recognized exactly what Nietzsche meant. Since the breakup, he had not simply been grieving. He had been collecting proof against himself. Every memory, every mistake, every insecurity, every flaw, building a case, conducting a trial, acting as both prosecutor and victim. And Nietzsche saw it immediately, so he spoke again. He said that another person's departure tells you something about their choice. It does not automatically tell you the truth about your value. And the words settled into the room with quiet force, because what they were feeling was no longer heartbreak alone. It was something deeper, a growing realization that the breakup itself might not be the greatest source of pain. The greatest source of pain might be the meaning they had attached to it. And meanings can hurt far longer than events. The rain continued falling outside, but for the first time since the conversation began, the young man was no longer asking why she left. He was beginning to ask something far more important. Who would he become now that she was gone? The rain still fell against the cafe windows. The streets outside still reflected blurred headlights across wet pavement. The conversations around them continued. The coffee machines hissed. People arrived. People left. Life moved forward with the same indifference it had always possessed. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same, because something had shifted, not in the cafe, not in the weather, not in the city beyond the glass, but in the way the young man now understood his loss. And that difference was enough to change everything. Because once a person begins to question the meaning they've attached to pain, pain itself no longer feels quite as powerful as before, and the people sitting beneath those warm lights felt it, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood rejection, love, self-worth, loneliness, and invisible dependence people often mistake for connection. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous. Not because it removes pain, but because it removes excuses. And Friedrich Nietzsche sat calmly beside the rain-covered window, not as someone untouched by loneliness, but as someone who had stopped demanding that life spare him from it. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because most people believe strength means avoiding heartbreak. Very few discover that strength is what remains after heartbreak arrives. The young man sat silently, looking through the rain, looking at the empty chair across from him, looking at the future he thought he had lost. Then he asked one final question, the question hidden beneath every breakup, the question beneath every goodbye, the question beneath every abandoned dream. How do I move on? The cafe seemed quieter after he asked it, not because the noise disappeared, but because the question reached deeper than sadness. It reached identity. Nietzsche answered calmly. He said that moving on is not forgetting. The words settled heavily into the room, because most people secretly believe healing means erasing memories, erasing emotions, erasing the significance of what happened. But Nietzsche continued, you do not become stronger by pretending something never mattered. You become stronger by allowing it to matter without allowing it to own you. The young man listened, because for the first time since the breakup, the goal no longer felt like escape. The goal felt like transformation. And transformation is a completely different journey. A woman near the window quietly closed her book. An older man stopped looking at his phone. Even strangers seemed unable to completely ignore the conversation. because everyone understood loss. Everyone understood longing. Everyone understood what it means to watch part of your future disappear. And Nietzsche continued. He said that many people spend years trying to recover the person they were before heartbreak. But life does not move backward. The person you were is gone. And that is not a tragedy. It is an invitation. The words move deeper than anything before them because they did not promise restoration. They promised becoming. And becoming is always more demanding than recovery. Recovery asks you to return. Becoming asks you to evolve. The rain continued falling. The city continued moving. And suddenly the young man understood something he had been unable to see before. The relationship ending was not the end of a story. It was the end of a chapter. And chapters are supposed to end, not because they were meaningless, but because they prepared you for what comes next. A long silence settled over the cafe. Then Nietzsche slowly stood. The evening had grown darker. The rain had become softer. And before leaving, he spoke one final time. He said that the greatest mistake people make after rejection is believing they lost their value when they lost a person. Your value was never inside another human being. It was always waiting to be discovered within yourself. And the words settled over the cafe with quiet finality because they did not promise another relationship. They did not promise happiness. They did not promise that loneliness would disappear. They promised something far more important: responsibility. Because responsibility is always heavier than comfort. And freedom is always heavier than dependence. And no one spoke after that because there was nothing left to fend. Nothing left to blame, nothing left to chase. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared into the rain-covered streets beyond the cafe, the young man remained exactly where he was. And yet he no longer felt the same. Because once a person realizes that rejection is not proof of their inadequacy, but an opportunity to become someone they could never have become otherwise, they cannot fully return to the comfort of believing they were broken.